Welcome to this reading. This is Professor Smith, and I will be recording the book After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, The Social History of Christian Polygamy by John Cairncross. Polygamy was forbidden after Roman papists took over the church. Isaiah 4 tells us the Astra strongholds denying every believing woman a good husband will be overcome at the last. Enjoy, and may the Almighty Yahweh bless you. Okay, so we're going to continue now with chapter 9, a doctrine daily defended. And so we've read a lot about some of the early writers and so on. Now we are going to get into the social aspect, the impact of what these writers have written on the common man in the streets. And it continues on here. If the climate of the age was such that even an Anglican bishop could break a lance for polygamy, the malady was much more rampant in the ranks of the freethinkers and the unregenerate. Just before the turn of the centuries, in 1696, for example, a believer is so alarmed at the spread of the pernicious doctrine that he thinks it worth his trouble to write a letter of advice to a friend upon the modern arguments for the lawfulness of simple fornication, half adultery, and polygamy, unquote. I am astonished, quote unquote, says the writer, to see such paradoxes of iniquity set up and to prevail so unreasonably among men that they think polygamy and fornication lawful. He bases his case on the constant tradition of monogamy in the church, and yet against the doctrine of Christ, concludes the author. Our thin bow would oppose their little criticisms and cover themselves with cobwebs. By the 1730s, the disease had turned into an epidemic. In the work dated 1737, an English clergyman observed, quote, polygamy is a doctrine daily defended in common conversation and often in print by a great variety of plausible arguments, unquote. What is worse, quote, those arguments are nowhere thoroughly examined and discussed, unquote. It follows that the determination of that point upon plain and clear principle is a matter of the utmost consequence to human society. The writer, whose name was Patrick Delany, 1695 to 1768, was so convinced of the need for a refutation of the grounds for polygamy that he devoted a book of some 200 pages to the task. It was a creditable success, to judge from the publication of a second edition some 2 years later, dedicated to no less a person than the Anglican primate of all Ireland, the Archbishop of Armagh. The choice of patron was natural, for the author was a close friend of Swift, like him, a dean of the Anglican Church in Ireland, and eulogized by him as, quote, the most eloquent preacher we have, unquote. Swift, no mean wit himself, praised his friend as, and here's the quote, you whose virtues I must own, with shame I have too lately known, to you by art and nature taught to be the man I long have sought, and as the epitome of humor, raillery, and wit. Delany was, like many Irishmen, something of an original. His more illustrious compatriot, the philosopher Berkeley, had devoted his declining years to preaching the virtues of tar water as a panacea. Delany's unconventional enthusiasms were less exclusive. His first work of any importance, which started to appear in 1732, is called Revelation Examined with Candor. Written in a florid, declamatory style, it maintains the perpetual obligation of Christians to, quote, abstain from things strangled and from blood, unquote. Some of his causes were less offbeat. Thus, he disagreed with his humanitarian friends, Swift and Sheridan, when they urged their womenfolk to dispense with silk in order to help the weavers, badly hit by the new fashion. Delany, on the contrary, was pleased when, quote, the woman whom the richest silks array refused to fling their shining gowns away, unquote. He maintained his argumentative zeal all throughout his life. In 1757, he started a review called The Humanist, in which he flayed the habit of docking horses' tails. But his major work is his refutation of polygamy, a mission which was, he felt, important and pressing, since he knows how long monogamy might thrive, quote, under the present increase of infidelity and licentiousness. There could, he was convinced, be no evil, quote, in preparing a proper antidote for a poison which might be administered we know not how soon. The freethinkers were to the fore in this offensive in favor of polygamy. Their position is cogently set out in a letter quoted by Delaney from an anonymous friend whose talents he had, quote, long admired, unquote, to a clergy in defense of Matthew Tyndall, the deist author of Christianity as Old as Creation, written in 1730. In that letter, the writer argues, it is not certain how seriously, quote, that we must allow not only a plurality of wives, but a number of concubines into the bargain, unless we give up at least some part of the scriptures and condemn the holy patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and above all, David, the man after God's own heart, who had at least 7 wives and 10 concubines without ever being admonished for it by any of the prophets or censured by any of the sacred writers, so that here, Tyndale will probably turn your own reasoning upon you that it is a weak thing of you to charge the law of nature as not strict enough when in your own scripture appear to be looser, unquote. Although Delaney's main targets are the ignorance and effrontery of modern freethinkers, quote unquote, he is forced to admit that these have been joined by renegades from the Christian camp. There was even a dissertation on the subject, of which there is no trace, said to be written, quote, by a Lord Chancellor of England, a man of such sagacity and fine parts, perhaps as any that ever presided in a court of equity, quote unquote. A judge from a note of Voltaire, this was William, 1st Earl Cowper, who died in 1723. Okay, so reader's note. So basically, what this is saying is the identity, or at least the presupposed identity, of this high-ranking individual in England, who basically was advocating for the principle to be restored among the people. And Voltaire appears to have identified him as William, 1st Earl Cowper, and he died in 1723. Continuing on. He is alleged to have lived in perfect amity with 2 wives. And Delaney cannot resist a dig at Burnet, a Christian bishop of no mean talents, unquote. Reader's note here, isn't that something? That would be they would let that go. It says here he was alleged to have lived in perfect amity with 2 wives. Well, I wonder if what they're talking about is successive marriages or at the same time. I mean, did he have 2 wives at the same time? That's a very interesting little note there, isn't it? He may have been somewhat alarmist, but the strength of pro-polygamy feelings at the time is shown by the tactics adopted by Delaney himself in presenting his book to the public. He wrote under the pseudonym of, this looks like something in Latin. It looks like Philoleuterus Dublianus, with an obvious echo of Lyser's nom de plume, Theophilus Aletheus. And the title is even more designed to attract the unwary. Reflections upon polygamy and the encouragement given to that practice in the scriptures of the Old Testament. Hence, as a latter polygamist, that's de Premonteval, was to assert, quote, everybody imagines that the book was written by another Lyser, who was, quote, making the utmost efforts on behalf of his dear polygamy, unquote. And it must be admitted that Delaney's attitude to polygamy at times verges on the ambivalent. In his main work, he shows treasures of indulgences for David's abundance of wives. And he carries his impartiality to even further lengths in his historical account of the life and reign of David, king of Israel, 1740 to 1742, in which he offers an apologia even for those crimes of which David repented. Reader's note. Just, as someone who loves old books, wouldn't that be something to get a copy of that one? Well, that would be very interesting because usually when you have these kinds of authors, 200 to 300 years ago, they didn't have phones and televisions and so on. There were books. That was what a man did outside of work. He read books, and the accumulation of knowledge was quite impressive. And the level of scholarship, uh, to say the least. Frankly, I have often thought it far more advanced than what is passing today as scholarship. But anyway, let me continue on. Delaney's book covers familiar ground, although he appears to imagine that he is a pioneer. His main thesis is that one can condemn the patriarchs for their polygamous habits and not give up the Gospels, but he possesses neither the necessary sophistication nor learning to make his approach plausible. He is compelled, time and again, to fall back on the lamest of reasonings. Quote, God's revelation as to polygamy was, unquote, he alleges, neither clear nor full, quote unquote, since it would appear that God, quote, suffered the revelation to be lost or obscured by the corrupt glosses and comments of idle and wicked men, unquote. His approach is equally ingenuous to the famous passage in Exodus which forbids a son having married one of his slaves in addition to his wife to diminish the privilege accorded to his first wife. Readers note that sounds like Exodus 21:10, where it says, if a man take another wife, he shall not diminish the food, clothing, and marital rights of the first. Since such a diminution looks like is unavoidable, concludes Delaney triumphantly, the passage amounts to a ban on polygamy, and his comment on Abraham's second marriage is equally wide of the mark. Let no man, he notes sagely, meddle with another woman except at his wife's earnest entreaty, and I am pretty confident that the world will never be overrun with polygamy or concubinage, quote unquote. He is much more stimulating when he takes up the cudgels for women. He denounces, quote, the miserable state of servitude to which the whole female world is reduced where polygamy obtaineth. If, he adds, it is contended that the women are doomed to subjection by God himself, I answer to subjection, but not to slavery, and God forbid this distinction should ever cease. Indeed, he goes much further and outlines the theory of the, quote, natural equality of desire between the two sexes. Polygamy, he argues, offends against this rule. For if in it desire, quote, can only be gratified in one sex, consequently, the other sex is injured in its rights. He is frank enough to admit that this reasoning, quote, will give him room for idle wit, unquote. But he firmly asserts that there is cases of a strong sex drive both in men and women, and that monogamy may bear both on hard. But if polygamy is to be allowed to ease the strain, so in fairness must polyandry, quote unquote. Readers know this appears to be a man who was advocating for women's suffrage and was sort of mixing his feelings into the subject matter of either permissibility of polygamy or not. So he sounds somewhat, as I said, ambivalent. In other words, he may have done so to protect himself, to cover all of the various arguments that he wanted to make, and to, put the issue out into the public domain at the same time, and yet be able to retreat on the back foot and say, well, I'm not really advocating for it. I am simply enumerating all of the arguments that people are making and finding, the basis for such. Continuing on. And although he devoted almost half his book to proving that polygamy has not led to an increase in numbers and that Christianity, despite clerical celibacy, has not reduced them, he is adamant on the right of children to a good upbringing and comments judiciously that, quote, the care of very few children, nay, oftentimes the care of one, may exhaust the parents' best hours and years. The revolution in the attitude to children, typical of the second half of the 18th century, and the appearance of Malthus at its end are not far off. And that concludes that section. Now, next they have a section titled, They Order These Things Better in France. And it continues. Whatever its shortcomings, Delaney's book makes lively reading, and it hit the market. The author had every reason to be satisfied with its reception, two English editions and a version in German and Dutch. The work was also translated into French, and if this version did not see the light of day, it was only because the translator decided he could greatly improve on the original, and so produced his own contribution to the campaign against polygamy. Hence, the work is included in the present chapter, rather than in those covering France. The man who went one better than Delaney was clearly not now lacking in confidence, and his career shows that he was nothing if not enterprising. At the age of 20, he was already running a successful course in mathematics in Paris. And somewhere along the line, the commoner Pierre Leguy was transmogrified into the aristocratic de Premontville, forced to flee the country to escape persecution, though evil tongues suggested that it was really to avoid his creditors. He sweetened his exile by taking with him a charming young lady, 8 years his junior, with the colorful name of Victorie Pigeon Diosangis, the daughter of an eminent scientist. With her, he said, we are assured, linked by bonds which, if not sacred, were at least indissoluble. He finally made his way to Holland, the refuge at that time of all shades of dissenters, and it was there that he dictated to his mistress, since his own eyesight was failing, his work called Monogamy or Unity in Marriage, 1752, which he dedicated to her. The book was published in The Hague in sections at the author's expense and by subscription. It must have been a fair success, for despite his poverty, he succeeded in publishing 3 of the 4 volumes planned. It was given special backing by the Protestant Church. The French refugee pastors in Holland subscribed en bloc for 27 copies. The edition can hardly have been a very large one, for the work is now a collector's piece and is not even to be found in the British Museum. De Premontville seems to have become involved by accident in the controversy over marriage. He was asked by a publisher to translate Delaney's work, but he could not bring himself to hand his manuscript to the printer, convinced as he was that the book was a huge hoax and calculated to shock unbelievers and Christians equally. He therefore paraphrased it, then, in true Cartesian style, turned it into a series of quasi-mathematical propositions, and finally hit on the idea, as he fondly believed, of enlivening the debate by writing an exchange of letters between the naive Ariste, who was under the influence of a wicked offstage miscreant, and the right-thinking Eudox, who triumphantly counters all the infidels' arguments and proves that polygamy is contrary to both natural law, the Old Testament, and the teachings of Christ. Reader's note here. So we see that they use this argument and rebuttal, argument rebuttal pattern in order to avoid the accusation that they themselves are making this argument. It was sort of a literary method of removing the risk of themselves many times in order to just display this dialogue between 2 individuals of vastly different backgrounds. And of course, probably the Muslim character that seemed to show up time and again was a pretty good fall guy, so to speak. So that the anger and invective was poured upon the character rather than the author bringing the subject into the public domain. That's quite an ingenious device, I think. De Premontville's revelation is, alas, even more fuzzy than Delaney's and is doomed to ridicule. He scorns to take shelter behind the corruption of the text and sets out to prove that the Old Testament simply condemns polygamy. As an exercise in wishful thinking, tortuous reasons, and soliciting of the text, he is a model of truly mathematical rigor. He performs the most extraordinary acrobatics to dismiss Abraham's second marriage as irrelevant, and he summarily disposes of Isaac and the wicked Esau. Let's see here. Let me check that again. And he summarily disposes of Isaac and the wicked Esau. but he surpasses himself over Jacob. He dwells on the fact that the patriarch took a wife at the age of 84 and that he was tricked into marrying Leah. And what makes the most indelible impression on him is Jacob's preternatural continence. During the 7 years that Jacob served for Rachel, he must have enjoyed infinite liberty with her, since he lived in the same house and met frequently in the countryside and the woods. The utter chastity of their relations is proven by Eudox, by the fact that the trick played on Jacob during his wedding night would immediately have been detected had he had the slightest familiarity with Rachel, or even conversations either too free or too animated, in which the natural impatience of the senses played too great a role. Had Jacob been less reserved, the night would not have passed in the profound silence which gave rise to the patriarch's mistake. In other words, he's speaking of being deceived by his father-in-law Laban into marrying Rachel, or Leah rather, instead of Rachel. Because remember, Leah was not his first choice. Readers know, additionally, I think that you see some of these silly arguments, they still crop up. They still crop up. Yeah, but it's hard to determine whether the intent of this author was such to make the argument so ignoble and, to be honest, absolutely stupid, that his intent was to ridicule the monogamy only position or to expose it to ridicule. This kind of back and forth had been employed before, as we've read earlier in chapters. So it's interesting. It's hard to know exactly what the author's intent is sometimes. It is easy to laugh off De Promontovo's ingenuousness. He was merely borrowed from the current works of piety in which Jacob's exemplary restraint was a commonplace. De Promontovo is on equally familiar ground when he denounces the evils of Muslim polygamy with its hordes of women confined in their harems and guarded by overbearing eunuchs. But he does confirm the spread of pro-polygamy views at the time. Many theologians, amidst Eudox, agree that polygamy is useful, respectable, and stimulates procreation, and even more telling an affirmation, quote, an almost infinite number of people agree that polygamy is sanctioned by the Old Testament and is not contrary to Christian sanctity. Indeed, this is an almost universal opinion, unquote. Like Delaney, he devotes an inordinately lengthy part of his work to an over-ingenious analysis of population movements, its growth, for example, in Europe before and after coming of Christianity, and in China, a country which had a special fascination for the French 18th century and where customs, faithfully reported by the Jesuits, powerfully contributed to the reinforcement of rationalism in the 18th century. But Eudox and Ariste alike agree that Europe is depopulated. Eudox asserts that this is not due to the practice of monogamy, but to monkish celibacy and to the triple scourge of war, plague, and the drain caused by colonies and foreign expeditions. But he is forced to admit that other forces are at work. There is, in France at least, a premeditated design on the part of most husbands and wives not to have too many children, a policy, quote, which is extremely unfavorable to propagation, unquote. And he asked why it is that so many marriages contracted in the flower of youth yielded only 2 to 3 children, or 4 at the most, and sometimes only 1. In France of 1750, we learn families of 7 or 8 were already regarded as oddities. To remedy this deplorable state of affairs, de Promontovo can only think of the traditional French policy of giving privileges to fathers of large families, and also, more modern touch, family allowances. As so often at turning points in the history of morals, de Promontovo's losing his bearings. He comes out in favor of the very trends which, had he but realized it, underlay his flight from numbers. For he at once argues that it is less important to have a large family than to have healthy children who will be given a good education. And he anticipates 20th century attitudes by laying down that a man suffering from a hereditary disease is not doing the country a service, but committing murder if he passes that malady on to his sons. But his basic thesis is that marriage is far from being merely a question of population. He has women's interests especially at heart. It is they, he reminds his readers, who have run the greatest risk, since childbearing is the most dangerous profession. It is they who suffer the most acute pain. Polygamy is therefore unfair to them, since they thereby have to languish in the incommodities of a long, arduous pregnancy while awaiting confinement precisely at the time when their desires are greatest. Echoing Delaney, he denies that special concessions must be made for men with a strong sex drive, while he asks whether men have to agree to similar latitude for women with a powerful temperament. In any case, and this is a startling addition on de Promontville's part, quote, one woman can suffice to quench the ardor of the man least disposed to continence, and possibly of more than one, unquote. There must, he insists, be absolute equality in marriage. Love can be repaid only by love, and, quote, it is outrageous for a man to be indignant at the slightest suspicion of coldness or unfaithfulness, while at the same time reserving the right to be an unfaithful or a polygamist as he pleases, unquote. He denounces satisfactions of every kind for one sex, mortifications for the others. He preaches reciprocal obligations, complete parity. Polygamy is only permissible if war wipes out half the men in a particular country, and even then, only for a generation. And he concludes with a fervent apology for women, quote, if they are inferior in a particular society, it is because men have made them as they are. In all countries, if women are not so strong as men, they are more beautiful and graceful. And when not held down, they have distinguished themselves in every science and art. De Promontville's feminist sentiments, however heartening, did not suffice to save his work from oblivion. It passed more or less unnoticed, except for a highly critical review by the famous German Old Testament scholar Michaelis. He did not even manage to complete the project, fourth volume, in in other words, he didn't complete the fourth volume. It was a four-volume work. He only got three. I think we read that earlier. Continuing on. In 1752, the great French mathematician Maupertuis, it looks like Maupertuis, arranged for him to move to Berlin under the patronage of Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, and join that monarch's collection of French men of letters and scientists, which at one point included even Voltaire. In Berlin, the German metropolis, de Promontville set up a school with, as ever, marked success. Yet he perpetually lamented that a further 3 months in Holland would have enabled him to complete his monogamy, and in particular, the desire to explain away King David's alleged polygamy pursued him in his dreams. That's because he knew he was lying against the patriarch, probably. His end was unhappy. A year before his death, he complained of frequent fainting fits and loss of memory, and his wife's health was poor, which forced him to look after the children. Yet his devotion to her and to his principles never flagged, and he had the satisfaction over Lyser, whatever the miserable end of both men, of having practiced his principles as well as preached them. Okay, that concludes that section. Now we have a section titled, For Frolic by Nature Designed. Let's see here. As the great man and his younger disciple were making their way homeward through the dim London streets after an intellectual but copious dinner, they were accosted by a woman of the town, quote unquote. The great man gently but firmly brushed her off, whereupon the two, quote, talked of the wretched life of such women and agreed that much more unhappiness upon the whole was produced by illicit commerce between the sexes, unquote. The disciple had not always held these views. He had an exuberance of amorous faculties, which was quite corporeal and unconnected with affection and regard, and he had been so constituted from his earlier years. From the age of 12, he was to write to a friend, quote, I experienced all that the soul can feel of passion. In childhood, he found an outlet in what he was to refer to cryptically as, quote, the fatal defect, but very soon graduated to higher things. On moving from his native Scotland to London, he at once plunged deep into dissipation, and his skirmishes with women of intrigue were legion. He was, as he describes himself most accurately, quote, for frolic by nature designed, unquote. However, it was in London that he met the master. And at once he assumed a more sober, dignified tone. Quote, since my being honored by the friendship of Mr. Johnson, unquote, for such was the great man, writes Boswell, his disciple and subsequently author of the unique biography, which was in 1740 to 95. I have more seriously considered the duties of morality and religion and the dignity of human nature. I have considered that promiscuous concubinage is certainly wrong. He goes on sententiously, and here's the quote. It is contributing one share toward bringing confusion and misery into society. It is a transgression of the laws of the Almighty Creator, who has ordained marriage for the mutual comfort of the sexes and the procreation and right education of children. Sure, it is that. If all men and women in Britain were merely to consult animal gratification, society would be a most shocking scene. Nay, it would soon cease altogether. Unquote. But even these profound conclusions on the evils of whoring were not enough to prevent Boswell from satisfying his exuberance. He was at 23 full of sap, and there was no holding him. And so, notwithstanding these reflections, I have stooped to mean, I think this is profligacy, even yesterday. But he was deeply repentant. However, I am resolved to guard against it. Alas, he was always to be on his guard, and always to stoop throughout his life. Reader's note, it appears that this fella had a fondness for loose women. And remember that the Catholic Church really kind of turned a blind eye to sexual relations between a husband and, say, a loose woman, even if it was married. And so, especially in young men, when they grew up and they got into the cities, of course, there's all kinds of opportunities for them to partake of, the sexual wares of women. But he struggled with this all his life, it says. Needless to say, Boswell never, as far as known, touched on his amorous expeditions with the Reverend Johnson. He was not even completely frank in his diary, for in his private memoranda, on the basis of which he compiled that work, he is rather less firm in his moral resolve. Swear, he writes, to have no more rogering before you leave England for the grand tour, except Mrs. in chambers. No doubt he felt emboldened to reveal his innermost intentions by the fact that the key word underlined was in cipher. So far he had merely indulged in prostitutes, but soon after, especially when he started on the traditional grand tour, he was launched out into much more ambitious ideas on sexual morality. In July of 1744, the following year in Berlin, there was a significant entry. Forget dreary ideas and sensual Turk ones. The latter phrase needs no elaboration. But it was not only the polygamous example of the Orientals which hovered before him. He too had realized the justificative, that's an interesting word, I don't think I've seen that in a while, justificative richness of the Old Testament patriarchs as a cover for his fiery moods and acts. Shortly after, he was in Brunswick, where he meets the sweetest girl I ever saw, quote unquote. It looks like a blanchisse. 18, fresh, gay. Her beauty thrilled my frame. I thought that I might be an old patriarch upon occasions, as could not see any harm in taking her with me. She refused to go, but promised to come back from time to time. Boswell needed little prompting to wave the patriarch's example as his fornicator's flag. However, it is just possible that he may have borrowed the idea from an uncle of his, Dr. John Boswell. In 1776, he talks to Johnson of his relative, and here's the quote. A sectary, he was a Glassite, a very religious man, who not only attended regularly in public worship with those of his communion, but made a particular study of the Scriptures and even wrote a commentary on some of the parts of them, yet was known to be very licentious and indulging himself with women, maintaining that men are to be saved by faith alone, and that the Christian religion had not prescribed any fixed rule for the intercourse between the sexes. Unquote. To which Johnson replied with his customary terseness, Sir, there is no trusting to that crazy piety. In December 1744, 6 months after the Blanchisse, Boswell was to force the reluctant Rousseau in his swift refuge to grant him an interview. With his usual brashness, he introduced himself as, quote, a man of singular merit, unquote, adding, although but a young man, I have had a variety of experiences with which you will be impressed. Open your door then, sir, he cried, to a man who dares to say that he deserves to enter there. Trust a unique foreigner. You will never repent it, unquote. Faced with such a barrage, the unwilling Rousseau had no alternative but to receive the Laird of Auchinleck, who, to do him justice, was at pains during the interview to justify his claim to uniqueness. He devoted a large part of the time to a defense of polygamy in the presence of Rousseau's mistress, Therese Levasseur. To tell you the truth, says Boswell, I can find no certain system. Morals appear to be an uncertain thing. Let me read that again. Morals appear to me an uncertain thing. For instance, I should like to have 30 women. Could I not satisfy that desire? And here is the back and forth conversation between the two. Rousseau answers no. Boswell asks why. Rousseau, ha ha, if Mademoiselle Levasseur were not here, I would give you a most complete reason. Boswell says, but consider, if I am rich, I can take a number of girls. I get them a child, propagation is thus increased, I give them dowries, and I marry them off to good peasants who are very happy to have them. Thus they become wives at the same age as if they had remained virgins, and I on my side have had the benefit of engaging a great variety of women. Rousseau, oh, you will be landed in jealousies, betrayals, and treachery. Boswell says, but cannot I follow the Oriental usage? Rousseau answers, in the Orient, the women are kept shut up, and that means keeping slaves. And mark you, these women do nothing but harm, whereas ours do much good, for they do a great deal of work. Boswell says, still, I should like to follow the example of the old patriarchs, men whose memory I hold in respect. Rousseau answers, but are you not a citizen? You must not pick one law here and another law there. You must take the laws of your own society. And that was the conversation written down. And it continues. Boswell was probably unconvinced, but at least he had the good grace to thank the French thinker for a, quote, truly gracious welcome, unquote. In the end, 1769, Boswell married his cousin, Margaret Montgomery, a beautiful woman, if we are to judge from her portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds. Her conversation, too, it appears, was nutritive. And according to Boswell himself, quote, it tempers and soothes my agitated mind. He always swore that he was deeply devoted to her. For a time he was faithful, but his powerful sex drive had not been weakened by the passage of the years, and his wife was, quote, averse to hymeneal rites and to much dalliance. By March 1775, things were heading for a crisis. And here's the quote. So, readers know, it sounds like he married this Margaret, and things really were good in the beginning, but she could not handle his incredible sex drive, and so she withdrew and was not so giving in that area. And so now here he is again. He is looking for an outlet. So here's the quote. I told her I must have a concubine. She said I might go to whom I please. She often said so. Though our scripture did not prohibit concubinage, yet the strain of the New Testament seemed to be against it, and the church had understood it so. However, as the Christian religion was not expressed upon the subject, I thought I might be a patriarch, or rather, as he is frank enough to admit, I thought I might enjoy some of my former female acquaintances in London. He realized that this would not be like Isaac Walton or John Donne. But then the patriarchs and even the Old Testament men who went to harlots were devout. I consider indulgence with women to be like any other indulgence of nature. And that is his quote. And it's a discussion with his wife. In short, Boswell was unsettled. It is clear that his speculation on concubinage reached a climax at this point. A few days later, he meditated on the subject of concubinage. And here's the quote. If it was morally wrong, Why was it permitted to the most pious men in the Old Testament? Nay, especially blessed with fruitfulness. Why did our Savior say nothing against it? If an alteration was to take place by a new positive institution, suppose a man is too many for one woman, to use a common phrase, may he not be allowed to have more? The elector of Hesse had an indulgence from Luther to have two. End quote. Very interesting. This was obviously the controversy that that Hess created when he begged Luther for the indulgence to allow him to take a second wife because his first wife could not produce a male heir for him. Being a man in a high position meant that his line would stop, and this was a serious matter. So I think we read earlier about this, but he mentions this. And so this story carried through as justification, even as far as, getting close to the 18th century. Boswell even wrote a letter on the subject to his old friend Temple, though not in quite such frank terms as this entry in his diary. In March of the following year, he returns to the charge. I did not see precisely a general doctrine for concubinage in the New Testament, and some Christians, even Luther, do not think it an indispensable duty to cohabit only with one woman. And he adds, my appetite that way was naturally strong, and perhaps rendered stronger by the latitude given him by his wife. She herself died in 1789, but both of them but both before and after she went, her husband continued to frolic with unabated vigor, no doubt with constant bouts of repentance and firm resolutions to reform. But in the end, the well seems to have run dry, for when he died in 1795 at the age of 55, he was, if we are to believe the Encyclopedia Britannica, worn out by the violence of his pleasures, quote unquote. Okay, so that concludes that section there. Now we have a section titled The Sin and Shame of Wesley Hall. It is far from pleasant, says the standard work on the Oxford Methodist, to conclude a book in darkness and pollution, but, it adds apologetically, the story cannot be fully told without reference to the sin and shame of Wesley Hall. The subject, polygamy, was indeed a nauseous one, but it was infelicitously added. There was at least one black sheep even among the patriarchs. Yet Wesley Hall, 1711 to 1776, that's his life there, had made a promising start. At Oxford, he was a disciple of John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, and he was described by the great preacher as holy and unblameable in all manner of conversation. He had even continually testified that he was well able to be a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven's sake. His confidence in his chastity was ill-founded, for if he fell from grace, it was because of an all too impressionable heart. Shortly after being ordained in 1734, he secretly courted Wesley's younger sister, Martha, but immediately proceeded to become engaged to the elder sister, Kezia, on the basis of a divine revelation and without consulting his spiritual guide or the girl's parents. A week later, when Martha had no doubt asserted her prior claims, he had a counter-revelation. Kezia, in her turn, was jilted, and he married his first love. Wesley was subsequently to claim that his rejected sister, quote, fell into a lingering illness which terminated in death, unquote. The truth was somewhat less dramatic. Kezia, sincerely or not, resigned herself at once to a single life as, quote, the most excellent way, and even went to live with her in-laws, being joined shortly afterward by her mother. Kezia's actions were naturally enough described by Methodist historians as strange, almost unaccountable. But it was not till much later in 1747 that Hall, by then in Salisbury, moved from his veiled polygamy to full-blooded pursuit of it. The first step to perdition was to consort with the Moravian sect, which had cast aside the ordinance of the Church of England and adopted the belief in the inner voice, that is, of faith alone. He spoke, Wesley asserts, with contempt of the public divine service, of private prayer, of baptism, of the Lord's Supper, fasting, the resurrection of the body, and also of abstinence. The rejection of abstinence applied to women. He had begun, says Wesley, very frequently to kiss the women of his flock. Wesley was not backward in denouncing Hall's moral laxity, and in the surviving account of the affair, cryptically summarizes certain scabrous passages from a letter to Hall as, quote, the things Hall had done with regard to more than one or two or three women, unquote. In fact, Hall had done much more than merely kiss his female followers. A notice in the Gentleman's Magazine of October 1747 gives a titillating account of the scandal. Many sober and judicious persons, it wrote of Hall, had feared that, quote, the nocturnal meetings held at his house had degenerated into love feasts, scenes of debauchery and impurity. These apprehensions were proved to be only too well founded. But one of his disciples, an 18-year-old serving maid, declared herself with child by him. When tackled on this score by the girl's employer, he tried to hush the matter up, and failing in this, carried her off into the country. He returned to face the reproofs of some of the charges. He was not in the slightest put out. He thought it no harm. He declared if a man's constitution required it, he might lawfully have to do with more than one woman, provided she was not another man's wife. And he made matters worse by impudently justifying the practice on taking formal leave of his corrupted flock by reference to the case of Elkanah, one of the polygamous patriarchs of the Old Testament, on which he largely expounded. Before fleeing to London, he stripped his wife of everything that could be converted into money, including her childbed linen, nor are we assured did he leave his flock in any better state, for, quote, the fire of jealousy has broken out in many families where wives and daughters were his followers, unquote. Wesley carries on the story from here in a long letter in which he delivered himself. You are in the belly of hell, he warned the reprobate, who had even stooped to frequenting the coffee houses, and he admonished him to repent before it is too late. It is a pity that we do not have Hall's version of the affair. The strictures of his former Methodist colleagues are perfectly understandable, but he must have been something more than a conventional libertine to justify the tribute paid to him by the highly respectable Gentleman's Magazine, to the effect that by an uncommon appearance of sanctity joined with indefatigable labor in field and house preaching, quote unquote, he had drawn multitudes of the meaner sort to attend him, quote unquote. And the account continues, though he had continually advanced the grossest absurdities, he so bewitched his followers that his words had greater weight with them than the words of Christ and the apostles. As it is, Hall has nothing left in writing except a poem which is no worse than the run-of-the-mill 18th century versification, and decidedly better than the effusions of the various members of the Wesley family. The poem is called The Art of Happiness, and is addressed to only one of his 10 legitimate children who survived beyond infancy, Wesley Hall, Jr. It advises the boy to follow the dictates of his nature as the best way of fulfilling the purpose of the Creator. It denounces superstition and bigotry in verses in which it is not difficult to recognize John Wesley and his brother Charles. And this is the quote: inspired with frantic, false, fanatical zeal, see with what rage they threat damnation, hell. In a less polemical mood, he eulogizes love, quote, the universal passion, and exalts reason as the truth that never can deceive, unquote, and as, this is the quote, the fairest mirror of eternal light. The Wesleys retorted by a few sharp volleys. When the boy died of smallpox at the age of 14, Charles wrote a funeral hymn and followed this up with a withering invective of the father, whom he brands as a murderer of souls, whose bosom is torn by furious lusts, and in a picturesque, if somewhat vague metaphor, he makes us listen to, here's the quote, the vagabond complain. The hymn concludes with a wish that God, quote, should snatch him from the eternal fire and let him in his arms expire. In fact, Hall showed some signs of repentance. He was summoned back from London by his wife to look after a seamstress whom he had seduced and was then in labor. He is reported to have been touched by this magnanimity in his wife's part. However, other infidelities followed until at length his wife was driven from the house. Hall pursued her and even carried her off in Bristol, in the very middle of a sermon which her brother Charles was preaching. "I was somewhat disturbed," notes the clergyman blandly, but he continued with the sermon, notwithstanding his inner torments. Unfortunately, the Methodist account draws a veil over Hall's further dissipations. It would be an odious task, it says, quote, to relate all the details of Wesley Hall's sad apostasy, unquote. Some details are, however, vouchsafed. He publicly and privately recommended polygamy as conformable to nature, preached in its defense, and practiced what he preached. Finally, he went off with a mistress to England, living the life of an adventurer, acting sometimes as a physician, sometimes as a priest, or figured away with his sword cane and scarlet cloak, assuming any character according to his humor or the convenience of the day. From Ireland, he immigrated to the West Indies with another mistress, lived there till she died, and then, only then, did he repent. If we are to believe the Methodist version, he made a good end. He returned to his wife in contrite mood. She received the erring husband cordially and looked after him devotedly until his death in 1776. Reader's note here, I have to say he had quite an incredible and probably a very holy wife. You have to admit, you have to give credit to his wife, all that she endured at the hands of this man. And I think it is somewhat disingenuous to say that he practiced polygamy. It certainly does not appear to me to be the practice of polygamy at all. In fact, he may have said this to justify his philandering, which really is what it is. It doesn't appear to be that he was trying to establish a family and bring these women together, but he was flying from one to the other to the next, and so on. So this is somewhat incredulous to suggest that the idea that he truly believed polygamy was justified when it appears his lifestyle was really not reflective of the chastity which polygamy, at least properly done, implies. Okay, continuing on. He was buried by Wesley himself. His last words were, "I have injured an angel, and an angel that never reproached me. It is not impossible, but this much is certain. She was no ordinary woman. Lean, lanky, preaching Mrs. Hall, as she was described by Dr. Johnson, a great friend of hers, bore her husband 10 children, all of whom died young. Had to fend for herself for most of her adult life, yet outlived them all. She departed this life only in 1791, the last of the Wesleys." Further reader note here, I often wonder if, you see, the mind is a very strange thing. And when a husband sees so many children dying, he begins to impart some level of blame upon, he makes, things up in his mind that he wants to blame the woman in some way. And this may have been perhaps a psychological, that part of the mix, so to speak, to try to analyze this man. But admittedly, I mean, look at all that his wife underwent. So many children, all of them died. And even the one that survived, I think it says he made it to 14. It's quite a deal there. Continuing on, this is the new title, Lewd Men and Bastards. Martin Madon's 1726 to 90 main claim to fame is that he wrote part of the well-known hymn, "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," but he was also the author of a weighty volume on polygamy called Thelaphithora. I think I've recognized that before. I think some other men have mentioned that book. I think it's Thilithithora, perhaps is the pronunciation, but if I'm wrong, put it down there in the comments, okay? By a piquant coincidence, he was, like Wesley Hall, a disciple of John Wesley. After a gay life at Oxford, he was called to the bar in 1748. But having gone to a sermon of Wesley's on Prepare to Meet Thy God, he was so moved that he stayed to pray. And in 1750 took holy orders. Like Wesley Hall, too, Madon was highly thought of as a preacher, being, as one of his adversaries was later to admit, deservedly held in great reputation for his distinguishable talents and filled with more than ordinary zeal for the cause of God. Little also is known except that he was tall and of a robust constitution and was passionately devoted to music. Unquote. Now, let me just say this one more thing. And I think I'm correct on this historical note, being that I was raised in the Wesleyan tradition. Uh, as I understand it, these men would have witnessed the absolute misbehavior of Wesley's wife. And I perhaps wonder if psychologically that spurred them to, in other words, if you experience or witness such incredible misbehavior, as Wesley endured. In fact, his wife would come to the fields where he was preaching reputedly. She would cast incredible aspersions at her husband while he's in the middle of a sermon. She tried to put as much shame on him as possible. Here's a man who tried to live what he thought was a noble and holy way. He only had her, and he had full control of his amorous inclination, it appears. There's just so much here to consider, isn't there? The forces that sort of create a man and what he does. So after 1765, he resigned from the ministry and set himself to compose his masterpiece on polygamy in the quiet of Epsom, a small town near London. How he came to adopt these views is as uncertain as in most similar cases. He may have heard of Wesley Hall's escapades, or he may, who knows, who knows, have come upon a copy of the legendary treatise on the question composed by his great uncle, the first Earl Cowper. Perhaps the ideas ran in the family. Whatever the motives for composing the work, Philiphothora, 1780, is an impressive piece of research. Originally published in 2 volumes, its final edition, 1781, runs to 3 and contains practically every argument that can be adduced in favor of Old Testament polygamy. It is obviously the fruit of wide reading and great erudition. His work contains all the standard specifics of Puritan polygamy. Plural marriage, he contends, was practiced in the Old Testament with God's blessing and not condemned in the New. Christ was himself descended from King David, a polygamist, which proves that the institution as a form of marriage cannot be held other than honorable. And there is no proof that Christ ever forced his polygamous disciples to repudiate their wives. Very interesting note there. That apparently there was this tradition that perhaps some of his disciples were at the time of Christ's life polygamous. Incredible factoid there. Look at that. So he must have had some basis. And perhaps, we here in 2026, when you look over of what the knowledge and what they had gleaned, the newer generations, there's little bits that get lost along the way, aren't there? But that is one I have never heard before. What he is pressing for is the revival of the Mosaic sexual code in its entirety, right down to the introduction of the death penalty for adultery. And he is at pains to distinguish between the Hebrew and Muslim forms of polygamy. The former is, quote, a holy and sober use of marriage circumscribed by holy laws and institutions. The latter is designed solely to pamper the appetite and to indulge love of variety at the expense of humanity. He's speaking of Muslim. The latter is the Muslim. But the essence of Madon's teaching is his insistence on the appalling situation of the unmarried girl who was seduced, cast off, and indeed punished for her crime, whereas the seducer goes scot-free. He insists that, as in the Old Testament, the seducer, married or unmarried, must marry the girl. This would diminish child murder, suicide, and abortion. As things are at present, observes Madon, such a step on the part of a married man would be punishable by death. The result of the disregard of the Mosaic law is, and he quotes, debauchery of wives by others, seduction, ruin of virgins, incentive to procuring abortion, the murder of newborn infants, and fornication. The only real and substantial difference between the ancient Jews and the Christians is this: the former took a plurality of women whom they maintained, protected, and provided for agreeably to God's word. The latter take a plurality of women and turn them out to ruin and destruction, not only against God's words, but against every principle of justice and humanity. Or, in other words, if the Jew took as many as he could maintain, the Christian ruins as many as he can debauch. The laws of time, as Madden quotes them, need not comment. Quote, every lewd woman which shall have any bastard which may be chargeable to the parish, the key words, the justice of the peace shall commit such lewd women to the house of correction, there to be punished and set to work during the term of 1 whole year. There was, of course, no punishment for the father of the child. It was the custom not to send it with the mother. It usually died as a result. The practice, notes Madon, has caused many a child murder. The burden on public funds may have been kept down by these ferocious measures, but only at the cost of murder. All this, he concludes, could have been avoided if the Mosaic principles regarding marriage were observed, these being, quote, the fixed and immutable determination of infinite wisdom, unquote. Under the present system, after seducing a woman, a man turns her loose upon the common, either to starve with hunger or rot by prostitution. And he goes on. Here's the quote. We may boast of our marriage and condemn polygamy, but there is not a nation under heaven where polygamy is more openly practiced than in this Christian country. For though a man can marry but one at a time, he may have as great a variety as he pleases without ever marrying at all. Our brothels and the wards of our female hospitals outdo seraglios far as regards female degradation. To punish a poor deserted creature for being a prostitute when it is put out of her power to force her seducer to provide for her as the divine law enjoins is equally cruel and foolish. Not very unlike the man who threw his child into a ditch and then beat him for being dirty. And he concludes, it is altogether to be wished that the kind of wives as observed among the holy patriarchs might be again observed among Christians, and especially the great and illustrious families. But Madon also rings the changes on the familiar theme of population. He is alarmed at the flight from marriage, which he initially blames on the cult of celibacy of the Catholic Church. This has led to a devaluation of marriage, which explains, quote, why our fleets want sailors, our armies men, why we so sensibly, acutely feel the immigration of people to our colonies abroad, why we complain of scarcity of people and see so many thousands of acres lie uncultivated and uninhabited, unquote. He takes the traditionalist moralist view that the disinclination to marry is due to, quote, the increase of luxury, unquote. We are so overwhelmed, he writes, with luxury, so sunk in dissipation, that the expense of the family is looked upon, as it certainly is under such circumstances, as an intolerable burden. The introduction of the Mosaic Code by forcing men to marry and support the women they seduce would sharply reduce recruitment to the ranks of prostitutes, thereby increase pressure on men to marry, and, by permitting one man to have several wives, make it possible to open the gates of marriage and hence of childbearing. Too many women who would otherwise have remained single. Madon is moved not only by consideration for the female victims of men's wiles, he is also eager, like so many other advocates of polygamy, to alleviate the sufferings of hen-pecked husbands. He insists, quote, the inferiority evidently stamped upon women by the God of nature, by whom she is placed under the absolute power of her husband, unquote. In real life, alas, this patriarchal picture was often far from being true. There were not a few females who, like the monopolists, take advantage of the poor husband's situation to lead him as they please for pretty much the same reasons as the ass in the fable insulted and mocked the poor old lion because it is not in their power to resent it as they might. A husband may be reduced to the status of an unmarried man by his wife's temper, levity, and other defects. Polygamy is the remedy for such a deplorable tyranny. It would take down the high spirit of these females and keep them under men's government. And he conjured up a vision in which the husband would really look like a man, the lord of his wife, the sovereign of his family, if he were permitted by the laws of the realm to say to an undutiful Vashti, quote, come no more before me. I will give my hand to another, unquote. One comment on Madden's book was short and flippant. Taking his cue from Nathan's denunciation of Uriah's murder in the Old Testament, it ran, and here is the quote. Says Nathan unto David, thou art the man. Deny it, David. Deny it if you can. No, no, says David, I will not deny. And all your pious logic shall defy, since Maiden vindicates polygamy. But otherwise, the reaction was violent. Maiden's book aroused a storm of protest. One of the mildest condemnations was that it should be burnt by the common hangman. Most of the replies to his book follow the same pattern. An anonymous gentleman of Devonshire accuses Maiden of wishing to allow men to take as many wives as their insatiable desires wish, asserts that none but whores and rogues can regard him as their champion, and wittily suggests that he be forced to put his doctrine into practice and marry a patriarchal number of wives that would speedily cure him of his errors. Readers note, these kinds of objections are often encountered by people who propose the same solution that many of these authors do. The writer also, like most of the critics, seized on the question of cost and harping on the expense. They were not merely revealing their English materialism, but tackling Madon on his weakest ground. He had admitted that the high cost of living or luxury held back a young man from marrying. How much heavier would be the burden if there were several wives to maintain? And it was not merely a question of sympathy with males about to found a family. There was a much more disastrous possibility in the offing. What would happen should the monarchy decide to go in for plural marriage? Suppose, says the, quote, anonymous gentleman, unquote, that the present king were to emulate Solomon, the most enormous and grosser of wives. The state's finance would be ruined. It would cost the addition of £1 million a year, about 120 million today, to the royalist list. Where, asked the writer solemnly, would the money come from? Your country groans under the burden of taxes, and he suggests the appeal has a familiar ring, that Madon would do better to look around for ways of increasing revenue rather than to risk raising the level of taxation. There could be no more effective argument against polygamy, and, in fact, other critics are either more abusive or less persuasive. The Reverend Thomas Wills, for example, dismisses Maiden's views as merely another attempt to justify the current practice of keeping a mistress. The book, says Wills, can hardly be by such a former ornament of truth as Madon. It must be a member of the Catholic Church, the mother of harlots. He agrees that with Madon, that adultery should be ruthlessly suppressed, but he is equally ferocious in opposing the legitimization of children born out of wedlock, since such a policy appears a proper means to prevent vice, as far as laws of man can prevent it, to encourage marriage, and to be a suitable punishment for whoremongers, thus ignoring Madon's contention that it was the women and their children on whom the blows rained, and not the seducers. He makes telling use of the stock argument that polyandry could be just as easily defended as polygamy, and of the analogy equally well worn between the incest of our fathers and patriarchal polygamy. Unions between brother and sister at the dawn of history were unavoidable, he notes, since mankind could not have been propagated and increased without this kind of marriage. Polygamy was also necessary then, but no longer is so. Wills really warms to the attack only when he reaches the question of expenditure. The nobles, he contends, would not adopt polygamy if for no other reason than that the greatest estates would be too small to maintain their numerous offspring according to their birth. The aristocracy would therefore soon be reduced to want and misery. Another refutation of Medon is attempted by a certain T. Cookson, a typical writer of the Enlightenment who links social institutions with education and the advance of reason. Moses, he argues, tolerated polygamy, since these were not the times for perfect institutions. He cites, as an illustration of his philosophy, the attempt by England to lead India to a more rational code of ethics. That the laws of England are preferable to the laws of Hindustan is a truth, he feels, that is self-evident. But yet these laws were ill received there. And the reason is that they were too precipitately introduced. Readers note, basically the argument he's making is that they too quickly tried to change ingrained culture, which had been, formed over centuries and centuries and centuries. Too quickly were the changes made. Therefore, there was a knee-jerk response, a knee-jerk kick from the natives of India. Let me read that again. But yet these laws were ill received there, and the reason is that they were too precipitately introduced before prejudice had been done away by the people being gently civilized. Polygamy and polyandry are caused in the main by want of a good system of education. Like the other two critics, he champions the freedom of women. Population will increase in step with their emancipation. That is, when the freedom of mankind and their happiness are attended to. Cookson looked to the future with the calm confidence of the 18th century humanists. He could not be expected to foresee that the spread of civilization to India and elsewhere would indeed result in a rise in population, such a rise as to constitute one of the most serious problems of the modern age. Cookson admits that, on the score of prostitution and its evil effect on population, Medon, quote, had an intention that was benevolent. And he goes on, he has represented the consequences of prostitution too masterly and so justly that I will lay it before my readers, whereupon he quotes extensively from this section of Medon's book. Yet even for this enlightened writer, it is the economic issue that weighs most heavily. He blames a load of taxes for the lack of the increase of our numbers. Ministers of the church, he complains, are taxed, whereas bachelors, who are numerous and pass their time in luxuries and ease, are not. And he argues convincingly that the present luxury, splendor and dress, equipage, furniture, and entertainment should militate against the introduction of polygamy. For thousands are now unmarried merely because they dread a numerous family from the known difficulty of supporting it. The final comment on Medon's works is in verse. It is by a relative of his, Cowper, best known for his poem on John Gilpin. As a refutation, it is of the slightest. It was written on the command of a patron. In fact, it is doubtful if Cowper ever read even a part of Medon's book, for he seemed to imagine that the work advocates the introduction of Moslem polygamy, complete with eunuchs, all of which Medon most explicitly condemns. The poem is an involved allegory in which Sir Ari del Castro becomes enamored of Lady Hypothesis, the wildest project of the teeming mind. Let me read that again. The poem is an involved allegory in which Sir Ari del Castro becomes enamored of Lady Hypothesis, the wildest project of the teeming mind. And here is the quote. That wedlock is not rigorous as supposed, but man within a wider pale enclosed. Here it is again. That wedlock is not rigorously as supposed, but man within a wider pale enclosed may rove at will where appetites shall lead, free as a bull that ranges o'er the mead. That lewd incontinence and lawless rape are marriage in its true and proper shape. And then Sir Airy dreams, and it continues, of rights restored, variety enjoyed, of virtue too well fenced to fear a flaw, large population on a liberal plan, and women trembling at the fist of man. And another paladin, Sir Marmedon, determines to avenge this slight on women's honor and transfixes him with a blow. The virtuous rejoice, and here is the quote. Then sang the married and the maiden throng. Love graced the theme, and harmony the song. The fawns and satyrs, a lascivious race, shriek at the sight, and conscious fled the place. Continuing on. With Madon, Old Testament polygamy had its last, if vigorous, fling in England. Reformers now concentrated on raising women's low status, on improving their education, and on reforming the approach to prostitution and vice. They ceased to debate whether the patriarchs practiced polygamy and campaigned for an attenuation of the patriarchal attitude in general. But if Puritan polygamy was on its last legs in Europe, it was to experience a singularly extensive revival in the less sophisticated atmosphere of the USA. Okay, and that concludes our reading for today. Next chapter is chapter 10, Singular Creed. And I think